This is a presentation about pharaonic power in ancient Egypt. We're going to begin with some material about the River Nile. This quote gives a good summary of the forces which have shaped ancient Egypt. It's from Pamela Bradley. The Nile and the sun were the two great forces which dominated the lives of ancient Egyptians. Their gifts of water, fertile soil, and warmth created life. On the other hand, they had the potential to bring destruction and death. Bradley points out here a very important point about ancient Egypt. The Egyptians were provided with water by the Nile, but the Nile would also flood each year. This was a big problem for them because it could cause massive destruction if the flood was too large. The sun itself would bring light and warmth which would help them to grow their crops, but the issue for this was that if you went out into the desert, the sun could also be a killer. The ancient Egyptians, as did many ancient civilizations, had the practice of creating gods who explained the function and way that particular forces in their lives operated. In this particular case, we're looking at Hapi, who is the god of the Nile. You'll see that Hapi is an unusual looking fellow. He has a crown which is made out of lotus blossoms which were found in the Nile. He has a scepter. The scepter is a rod held by the king, and certainly in Egypt this was the case. This thing here, which looks like a mushroom and two cupcakes, is actually an offering of food. Hapi also has a couple of other unusual features. You will see that his skin is indeed blue because he's a water god, but also Hapi has, pendulous breasts. It was believed that because Hapi was a bringer of life, he was more like a woman, so he was shown having breasts like those which suckle the young. This is an example of a primary source from ancient Egypt, which is called the Hymn to the Nile. And it starts like this: "Hail to thee, O Nile, who manifests thyself over this land and gives darkness to life in Egypt. Mysterious is thy issuing forth from the darkness on this day whereon it is celebrated. Watering the orchards created by Ra to cause all the cattle to live, you give the earth to drink, inexhaustible one. Path that descends from the sky, loving the bread of Seb and the first fruits of Nepera, you cause the workshops of Ptah to prosper. Lord of the fish, during the inundation no birds alight on the crops. You create the grain, you bring forth the barley, assuring perpetuity to the temples. If you cease your toil and your work, then all that exists is in anguish. If the gods suffer in heaven, then the faces of men waste away." In this one, it uses a tone which we would probably call worshipful. Remember, that tone is the way something sounds. It also makes reference to a few individuals you won't have heard of, possibly. That's Ra, it is Seb, Nepera, and Ptah. These are other gods of Egypt who believed sort of worked with Hapi in order to bring life. You'll also see this idea that Hapi could also bring the bringer of suffering as well. This is a map which shows the River Nile from obviously a bird's eye view, and it gives us a bit of an insight into why Egypt was like it is. This section here is called the Nile Delta. You can see that it goes off into a number of tracts. It's really pretty low and marshy. The river runs down through a channel, down through here, and down at this end there is a series of things called cataracts. At those cataracts, which continue all the way through, there's about 8 of them, there's a series of large boulders which stop the river from being travailed from that end. You can see here the Sinai. Sinai is a desert. Over here is the Sahara or Libyan desert. Mediterranean Sea up here, Red Sea down here. This little thing here is called the Fayum. The Fayum was a series of lakes and marshes which were important to the Egyptians. You can sort of see if you look at it that the River Nile is kind of shaped like a flower. This section here is referred to as the delta, which is the flat marshy area. This part here, as I said before, are the cataracts. Here's a typical view of the Nile. Okay, so we've got in this one the Nile River, the Nile Plain, the desert rim, and that would be on both sides. The Nile is typically anything from a few hundred meters wide to a few kilometers. This here is what it looks like in the delta, that is the marshy part at the opening of the river where it goes into the Mediterranean Sea. You can see here it's been cultivated a lot for date palms, but it would have been a very marshy area with lots of small channels. The Egyptians didn't call it the Nile, they called the river Itiru, which just means river. There are actually two Niles, the Blue and the White Nile. These are ones that join together, and by the time it reaches Egypt, it's just one river by itself. As mentioned before, there are the cataracts, and the cataracts began at a place called Elephantine, which was considered to be the frontier of Egypt. We talked about the Fayum, the Delta, and the Egyptians believed that the Nile was like a lotus, which is this flower here, and if you remember, the Delta channel, and it's got the little bud of the lotus, which is called the Fayum. This is a modern picture of the cataracts, but gives you a bit of a sense of what they're like. Very narrow channels in here and here. If this is in time of flood, absolutely impossible to navigate. You can see there's little boats and things going down here, but a pretty difficult area to travel through. You can again see the symbolism of the flower here. The river valley, the bud, growing out in a desert. This is a pretty old picture of the Nile in flood. There was a dam put into the Nile in the 1960s, and so consequently it doesn't flood like this anymore. But the Nile used to flood once a year, every year, pretty much for all eternity. And so in the 60s they decided to put up the Aswan High Dam. Seemed like a good idea at the time, but it's actually messed up the river a fair bit. The Nile flood was interesting. It usually happened over the months of June, August and September. It began as a green colour and then it turned to a muddy brown. The river reached its lowest point in May, and the Egyptians used to measure the river's flood in a series of things called Nilometers, which we'll have a look at in a minute. They had scientifically worked out what a good flood was like. 7.5 metres was the ideal flood. If it went to 8 metres, it was considered dangerous and would cause a great deal of destruction. If it hit 6 metres, it was way too low. The Nile itself also brought with it a great deal of silt. Silt is fine, eroded material, which is basically like natural fertilizer. So when the flood would rise up out of the river, it would bring with it silt, it would cover the fields, the silt would wash into it. I mentioned before that in the Nile they'd set up a series of Nilometers. This is an example of one of them that still exists today. You can see that it's got a pretty well-trodden path. The Nilometer was a series of measuring marks which would identify how high the Nile flood was going to be and give the people an indication of what they should prepare for. If the flood was going to be a particularly large one, so hitting one of these upper Nilometers, then they needed to evacuate towns. If it was going to be a low one, they realised they needed to start rationing food because the next year was going to be a pretty tough one. The Nile allowed the Egyptians to clearly delineate their land. They believed that the land which was black, that is under the nice black fertile silt, was called Kemet. The desert, or red land, was called Deshret. They had a name for the upper part of Egypt. Now, weirdly, this is the part at the bottom, or southern Egypt, that they called Shemau, and lower Egypt was called Tomehu. That's the upper part of Egypt. The reason they considered it upper or lower because they were basing it on where the river was flowing. They were surrounded, as I mentioned before, by desert borders in the Mediterranean Sea. So, little chance of invasion because of these natural barriers. The impact that this had on Egypt, the Nile River, it gave them a really clear set structure. They based their seasons on flood time, there was planting time and harvest time. The whole administration of Egypt really came about because of the need to organise for the flood, to be able to prepare and ration food, to be able to organise themselves to rescue people from the flood, to be able to move people out of harm's way. The Nile gave them their sense of communication and transportation in that everybody moved up and down the Nile. It was their highway and their main form of communication. Building, crafts, decoration were inspired by the Nile. If you look at an Egyptian temple, you'll find a lot of the stuff that is in there is based on images that they saw on the Nile. It gave them a lot of a sense of their religion and morality as well. And we'll talk more later on about life after death and their. Some people consider that the flooding of the Nile was actually so crucial to the establishment of Egyptian civilization that it's actually the central theory. This is referred to as adversity theory. It was put forward by a guy called Arnold Toynbee, who is a British historian, who said that without a challenge that was successfully met, a society would stagnate. So this is therefore called adversity theory. For the early civilizations, the challenges were the environment in which they lived. So particularly for the people of Egypt, the adversity was the flood. So according to Toynbee, without the flood, Egypt wouldn't have been Egypt. The following just a few pictures of Egypt to give you a sense of how little some of the things have changed. This is an Egyptian village now. Okay, so this is pretty much exactly what it would have looked like thousands of years ago. This is a felucca. It's a modern sort of Egyptian boat, but you can imagine the sort of these sort of boats going up and down the river in ancient past. In the background, you'll see a temple, and you can see how close it's built to the Nile and how narrow the river valley is here.